It is good to be together tonight on this Wednesday evening. I know we're probably going to have a large online audience tonight because of all those that are recovering at home and those that are going through various situations, but we nonetheless continue to pray for them and pray that their recoveries will be quick and they'll be back here with us very soon. We're going to be launching into Lesson 28 tonight. We're going to be picking up on page number 15, so I would invite you to be turning there with me in your Old Testament Simplified. If you do not have your Old Testament Simplified, the notes will be here on the wall here for your convenience. And so we are going to be picking up here with point number B, letter B here tonight, and talking about the life of Abraham. Now keep in mind, this will take us back to the patriarchal era here. This, of course, precedes and predates the Mosaic Law. You, of course, as we've been reminded, you, of course, have those three distinct time periods that God's law has been in effect for humanity. The patriarchal law, the Mosaical law, and the Christian law, the Christian dispensation. We, of course, are still in that Christian dispensation today. Of course, the Christian dispensation is the product, the result of the patriarchal law and the Mosaic law, specifically the Mosaic law, because contained therein you had all those prophecies that are pointing to the time of Jesus Christ. And so as we hone in on this and we look at the book of Genesis, of course the book of Genesis highlights this. It highlights the patriarch here, the patriarchs I should say here, and we have here highlighted for us Abraham. Now keep in mind, Adam, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all of those great figures play a part and play a role in the patriarchy. And so this, of course, was going to be God's will for them in His obedience. Now keep in mind also, this was also, the patriarchal law was going to prepare God's people for the Mosaic law to take effect. Now that wouldn't ultimately take effect until Mount Sinai takes place. And so even under the time of Egyptian bondage, you know, the 10 plagues and the events as they unfold in Egypt, you're still under this time frame. Now you're in a transitional part. You're in the introductory stages, we might say, of the Mosaic law, but nonetheless it's coming. Just as you have that time period between the Mosaic law and the Christian law, and the Christian dispensation, when we arrive to the time of the Gospels. And so you have this intermediate period, this time of preparation, if you will. But before that, really launching into this heavily here, you have the life of Abraham. Now, as it is true throughout the theme of the entire Old Testament, the promise is given to Abraham. We see that in chapter 12. When we go back to our timeline in the introduction in the Old Testament Simplified, and on that chart there, you're going to see that time period there that's made. That's Genesis chapter 12. Number 2, we see Abraham's plan, chapter number 13. Number 3, we see Abraham's protection, chapter 14. Number 4, we see Abraham's promise once again. We see Abraham's progeny through Ishmael, chapter 16. We see the Abrahamic promise, number 6, under a specific law, and that is circumcision. Now keep in mind that, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, that's going to carry over into the Mosaic law, right? That's going to be a specific law, a specific requirement of obedience that God is going to put in place for His people to keep them distinct. That's very important. That's chapter 17. Number 7, we see Abraham's plea for Sodom, chapter 18. That's a big one. That's a key moment in Old Testament history. Number 8, we see the destruction, the incineration, if you want to call it that, of Sodom. It was completely destroyed, completely obliterated because of its wickedness. And you have two subpoints under number 8 here. The origination of the Moabites began, verse number 37 as a reference. And the origination of the Ammonites began, verse number 38. So from that you have these two distinct sects, we might call them, that are going to originate here. Number 9, we see Abraham's pretense, chapter 20. Number 10, we see Abraham's posterity, and that's, of course, through Isaac, chapter number 21. As we continue to go here, we're going to see Abraham proved, chapter 2. That's an easy way to remember that. Or that should be chapter 22, I'm sorry. And number 12, we see Abraham's pain through Sarah, chapter 23. We see Abraham's pursuit, chapter 24, and Abraham's parting, chapter 25. This highlights, of course, the life here, the lifetime here of Abraham. Now, I know I sped through that, but as you and I go back through the life of Abraham, and we spot out and we point out some specific teachings there, two of them, of course, surpass any others. That would have to be the destruction of Sodom, of course, dealing with, of course, Lot and his wife, and the sin of that city, but also, specifically pertaining to Abraham, is, of course, the offering of Isaac, right? That would have to stand alone in the life of Abraham. That is a very, very prominent event in his life, because there are some very real and very important similarities that are connected between that event and also with the death and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Now, also, not only that, the lessons you can extract from that are amazing to me. In fact, I believe it was last year, we looked at a lesson on similarities between Isaac and Jesus, right? And we looked at how the Bible describes some specific things with the sacrifice of Isaac that was in Abraham's mind done. And we also looked at some similarities of Jesus. Now, a couple of those things would be, of course, Isaac submitting himself, Abraham submitting himself to carry this out. We see a similarity of Jesus submitting himself and carrying out that perfect plan. We see Isaac carrying the wood to the place of sacrifice. What do we see Jesus do? He carries the crossbeam to the place of crucifixion. When you go even further and even deeper in that study, what you're also going to notice is you're going to notice that the place that Abraham offered Isaac in that time would be in the same vicinity, if not the same vicinity, of where Jesus Christ would be hung on a cross on the mountain of Golgotha, the hill of Golgotha, and slain, of course, for the sins of the world. There are very real and very active similarities between those two accounts. Several more could be listed. But we also learn from that something else about Abraham. When we think about Abraham, and what's so interesting is the Old Testament in this account does not tell us this until it's retold by the inspired pen of the Hebrew writer in the book of Hebrews. You and I looked at this a couple of weeks ago when we were going through the Hall of Faith there. And what we found out was that Abraham, the text says there, if I can paraphrase, it was this offering of his son was a done deal. It was going to be carried out in the mind of Abraham. He was not going to let anything stop him. God said to do it, and he was going to do it. It was as good as done. Now, what we appreciate there is a great deal of faith and a great deal of obedience when it comes to the life of Abraham himself. Put yourself in the position of Abraham for just a moment, and you are trying to mull over in your mind what's going to transpire when you arrive up on top of this mountain. God has told you to offer him, take thy son, thy only son. By the way, that's another similarity between the death of the sacrifices here between Isaac and Jesus. Now, Isaac, again, knows nothing of this. Abraham, of course, the trek there, I would have to go back and look, I believe it's approximately 3 days, maybe longer. I'd have to go back to verify that. But during that time period, as he is making this trek to the place of sacrifice, what had to be going through this man's mind? Here he is, the son of promise. Here is the son that God has told me all of the nations of the earth would be blessed, and now I'm going to have to offer him up for a sacrifice. How easy would it have been for him to say, I'm not doing this? There's no way I can do this. This is my only begotten son. This is my only son. This is my flesh and blood. I cannot do this. But Abraham, with his faith, remember our definition of faith, biblically speaking, taking God at his word, acting upon it in obedience with trust. That's biblical faith. Biblical faith is not a feeling. Biblical faith is not a warm, fuzzy feeling of the heart, or it's not any other type of emotion. Biblical faith is taking God at his word and acting upon it in obedience. Hebrews chapter 11 teaches that 1,000 times over. And embedded in that great chapter, we see the faith of Abraham on full display. When he says that, in essence, if I sacrifice my son, God will raise him from the dead. That's how much faith, that's how much trust, that's how much love Abraham had in the God of heaven. Now I want you to put that in its proper perspective. By the time the Hebrew writer pens the book of Hebrews, and he reiterates this story of Abraham, what we see there on that occasion is, yes, humanity had seen resurrections. Humanity had seen Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. They had seen Jairus' daughter raised from the dead. Individuals had witnessed a great resurrection from the many bodies that slept in the graves. And when the great earthquake took place after the crucifixion of our Lord, the text says in the book of Matthew, the graves were open, and they that slept there rose from the dead and went into the holy city. They went back into Jerusalem. Humanity had seen resurrections. By the way, I believe we overlooked that great resurrection at the scene of the crucifixion. I don't remember, and I've heard a lot of gospel sermons on the crucifixion. All very, very well put together, but I can count on one hand how many times I've heard one where, in the aftermath of the crucifixion, we see a resurrection of humanity take place. Very fascinating to me, but it's there in the book of Matthew. And so what we have here, we have humanity seeing a resurrection. Resurrected people from the dead. Now, even at the time, the Hebrew writer, by inspiration, pens that retelling of Abraham. But now go back to Abraham. Dear friends, what is so impressing is you can read Genesis chapter 1 through Genesis chapter 22, 23, 24, 25. What you will not find is one instance that I know of God ever raising anybody from the dead. It had never been seen before. So here is Abraham's faith that says, yes, this is a done act of my obedience. My son is as good as dead, but I've never seen it done before. But I know Abraham would, in essence, say, I know the God I serve has the power to raise him back to life. What an overwhelming lesson of biblical faith that is. That stands the test of time when it comes to these Old Testament figures and their faith. I might dare say Abraham in that moment, his faith, I don't want to say surpasses the faith of others, but dear friends, it's very close. Now Abraham faltered, just like the others faltered, and they have their weaknesses. But in that act of obedience, and in that act, in that specific event, his faith has to be noted as something as very, very special. When you do a deep study on it, and when you take what the Hebrew writer says about it, and then you get the full perspective. It's amazing. Now, leaving Abraham, let's launch into Jacob here. The life of Jacob, let us see. As we look at the life of Jacob, once again, we see several key events here that stand out among the rest. We see Jacob's pottage in chapter 25. That has to stand out. We see Isaac's promise in chapter 26. We see Jacob's pretense, chapter 27. Jacob's plight, chapter 28. Jacob's prosperity, chapter 12, as well as chapters 29 and 30. Jacob's parting from Laban, chapter 31. Jacob's prayer and promise, chapter 32. Jacob's peace, chapter 33. Jacob's provocation, chapter 34. Jacob's purging, chapter 35. And Esau's pedigree, chapter 36. We're going to use those as bookends for the life of Jacob. This is where we could place these. These are the key events in these chapters in the book of Genesis that highlight these acts here. You see acts of waywardness. You see acts of obedience. You see a man here who, yes, loves God. We know he loved God because he is restated in the Hall of Faith, right? By faith, Jacob, when he carried out those acts and is noted for those acts of obedience. Back last year, I had the privilege of speaking at a summer series at the Cookville Church of Christ, and their theme for the entire summer, it was a Wednesday evening series. Each week they had a different speaker coming in. They asked me to come. I believe it was toward the end of that series. But the person that I got, the individual I got from the Hall of Faith here was Jacob. That was their theme. And I learned a great deal when I was putting together that lesson in the life of Jacob. I saw and was reminded of some things that I had never looked at before. His life is like that of the others. It is a life of faithfulness. Now you see some interweavings here among, of course, Isaac's here. His promises again restated. It all ties back to the promise, right? You have here the promise of Christ here ultimately, where all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And lastly here in chapter number 36, highlights the pedigree. Again, the lineage, the family tree, we might say, is restated here through this pedigree again in chapter 36. And I know if you're like me and you get bogged down with all of those names and all those connections and so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so, I know that can bog us down as a Bible student. And it may not be some of the most enjoyable topics to study, but nonetheless, dear friends, we need to be reminded of them because they have great, great significance. We may not be able to say all those names. Even I couldn't say all those names. And I've gone through them dozens of times. But they still have significance behind them because of this. They show us and lead us ultimately to Christ. But they also prove Bible inspiration going all the way back to the beginning. Many of those great figures are restated once again in Matthew chapter 1. You have here that pedigree, that lineage given there. Tying, of course, these Old Testament, some of the same ones we're talking about right now, tying them directly to the lineage and the family that would ultimately bring Jesus Christ into the world. We've got to be thankful for them. And we need to be and put them in their proper perspective. Letter D. The life of Joseph. We have here the purchase of Joseph, chapter 37. The preservation of Judah, chapter 38. The pursuit and prison of Joseph, chapter 39. Perception of Joseph, the dreams of the baker and the butler, chapter 40. The promotion of Joseph, chapter 41. The payback of Joseph, chapter 42. The party of Joseph, chapter 43. The plot of Joseph, chapter 44. The presentation of Joseph, chapter 45. The pleasure of Joseph, chapter 46. The present to Joseph, Goshen, chapter 47. Promises of Jacob, chapter 48 and 49. And the passing of Joseph, chapter 50. What a great, great life that Joseph lived. And we see here what's so very interesting here, this very, very familiarly told story of the Old Testament. Again, it's one similar to that of Abraham that stands out among the rest with the key things that happened to Joseph. That event teaches us perseverance. That event teaches us patience. That event teaches us to always continue with biblical faith, obedience, and trust. That event teaches us to always rely and beseech God in time of need. Think about what happened to Joseph just a moment as we rehearse this. We have him getting sold literally into slavery. We have him having him as in appointed to a state of highlight when he, of course, was going to be Potiphar's, we might say, right-hand man. And then all of a sudden you have Potiphar's wife interjecting her deceitfulness and lies into the situation. What happens? He gets thrown into prison. He's at a low point for an extended period of time, but he never loses faith. Ultimately, he is placed in a position of second in command over the land. And all during that time, what happens? His dreams and his visions and those by way of prophecy come to pass just as God foretold them. That those brothers of his would ultimately be, in lack of a better term, at his mercy. That happened when that great famine was going to take place, right? We see here Joseph serving that pivotal role in that moment in time for those purposes. It's a lesson of faith. And as we look at the summary, and this is going to work out good because our time's about up, we look here as we break this down with the patriarchy here. We see, and going again, tying this back to creation, we see the sanctification of creation, Genesis 1:31. We see here the sin of creation, Genesis 3:1-6, the fall of man, of course. We see the salvation. We see the paradox, the God's promise here of bringing salvation into the world, Genesis 3:15. We see the surety of creation, Genesis 4-16, and that's going to be preserved. That promise is going to be brought to pass through the events of human history, through these great figures, Seth, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Judah. Ultimately, and that would ultimately arrive us to Jesus Christ. A lot of things are going to transpire. A lot of faithfulness, a lot of unfaithfulness through God's people are going to come and go. A lot of kings are going to be elevated to places of kingship and rule over, of course, God's people. A lot of turmoil and heartache is going to take place. And of course, a lot of judgment from God is going to be brought upon His people. But here's the takeaway from this: God has always demanded the same of His people, of those two time periods, as He does today, and that's this: it's obedience. God has always demanded and required obedience for those that are His children, and for those that are of the world. They've got to ultimately today obey the gospel. And that's where we'll leave our study for tonight. Is there any questions or comments as we close? Yes.
We was talking about, Abraham and his son. He had the faith that, if he did take his life, he would raise him from the dead again. That's just like we are today, the world we live in, and the new covenant we live under. We've got faith. And it's true faith. We trust in the good Lord. He's going to see us through anything.
Right. Not only difficulties we're faced with here, because we're going to be faced with difficulties, but ultimately, if our faith will persevere and our obedience will persevere and get us through those things, what's going to happen when we arrive at the end of this life? Eternity is going to be secure. We're not going to have to worry about anything else. That's the type of faith Abraham had. That's the type of faith Isaac had. That's the type of faith that all these other individuals of the Hall of Faith in Hebrews, that's all the type of faith that they had. And you and I would do well to mirror our faith after theirs. Now, I know we don't live under that law that they lived under. We don't obey those commandments as they did. We have a far better covenant, right? We have a covenant that, of course, put away and put to pass all of those things, established and built upon better promises. The things, as the New Testament says, that the angels desire to look into. You and I can be the recipients of those things through and by the saving blood of Jesus Christ. Lord willing, Sunday morning, we'll pick back up here on page number 17. We're going to look at these rhymes here. This is going to be a fun exercise for us, because what we're going to do, we're going to take each chapter here and we're going to use a theme or a word found in that chapter to rhyme the chapter with. So it will be a good memorization tool for us. And so we'll do that here with all 50 chapters here. That'll probably take us a little while to get through. And then we'll look at a summary, if we have time, of Genesis 3:15. We'll look here at a couple of key points here from the Abrahamic covenant. And then finally we'll arrive to the review questions. We'll go through those together and launch on into Exodus. So I'm looking forward to that. Hope this study has helped you and encouraged you. And Lord willing, we will pick up here Sunday morning.